You're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, the Spurs went 4-0 this past week in a slate of games that included two really good teams and the biggest comeback of the season for the Spurs. The Spurs have continued to remain a juggernaut since late January. And finally, previewing another tough schedule of games for the Spurs this coming week. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Spot Up Pod. We have 4 games to get through from this past week for the San Antonio Spurs, where they went undefeated. So let's go back to last Tuesday. The Spurs were finishing up their Rodeo Road Trip on the road in Philadelphia to play the 76ers for the first time this season. The Spurs were favored by 7.5 points, and the reason being that, yes, the Spurs were without Harrison Barnes due to injury, but the Philadelphia 76ers were missing Joel Embiid, Paul George, and Kelly Oubre Jr. And then early into this game, VJ Edgecombe, one of the standout rookies this year, did get hurt, and he was unable to return to the game. So this game basically turned into a blowout in the second quarter when the Spurs went on a 34-17 run. And then from there, it was all Spurs the rest of the way. Just pounding the Sixers. The Spurs ended up leading by as many as 49 points in this game, which was the most San Antonio has led by this entire season. And they ended up winning by 40 points very comfortably with the reserves closing out the game. The Spurs had 4 players who had really good games for their team. Devin Vassell ends up with 22 points and 5 rebounds, shoots 6 of 8 from three-point range, 2 steals and 1 block in only 23 minutes because of the blowout. Stephon has a strong performance of 15 points and 10 assists in just 21 minutes, again, because of the blowout. Rookie Dylan Harper had a good scoring game with 22 points off the bench in only 22 minutes. And then Victor Wembanyama ends up with 10 points, 8 rebounds, and 6 blocks. And of course, because of the blowout, he only played 24 minutes, so the Spurs kick off the week with a win in Philadelphia. Then on Thursday, the Spurs were back home after the Rodeo Road Trip had concluded. They were hosting the Detroit Pistons, who are the number 1 team in the Eastern Conference. Obviously, this is a big game because these are 2 of the top 3 teams in the NBA at this time, the Spurs and Pistons. So the Spurs, because they were home, they were narrow 2.5-point favorites. If we recall to the previous meeting, the Pistons were the ones who were the favorites last time. The Spurs, I will say, were again without Harrison Barnes dealing with that ankle injury. But the Pistons did have their full team, although early in the game, defensive wing All-Star Thompson did get injured and didn't return to the game. But again, this was pretty much Spurs the whole way once again. The Spurs got some separation in the first quarter with 5 minutes left, going on their own 7-0 run to lead by 12. Then from there, they led by 15 after the first quarter. And then from that point on, they basically held a double-digit lead for most of the game. Yes, there was a few times the Pistons would get within like 8 points, 9 points of the Spurs. But, it got no closer. Basically, by the fourth, the Spurs end up going up by as many as 22 points. Again, another very comfortable lead against a really good team. And they ended up winning comfortably by 15 points against the best team in the Eastern Conference. And one thing I want to note is that, the Pistons have basically been spiraling ever since this loss. They've been struggling right now, and they're barely holding on to that number 1 seed out east with the Boston Celtics right on their tail. The Spurs had 2 players who really stood out in this game. That was Victor Wembanyama, ends up with 39 points, 16 rebounds, and 5 blocks in 39 minutes. Now, what's important there are those 39 minutes, because for Wemby, this is the most minutes he's played since a late game in October against the Miami Heat when he got up to 40 minutes. So again, for Victor, this was a big deal because he had not played this many minutes all season since that point up until early October. So that was notable because it's going to impact what happens the following night. Then also De'Aaron Fox had a really good game with 29 points and 5 rebounds in 32 minutes. So the Spurs' 2 All-Stars leading the way there against Detroit, one of the top teams in the league. And so basically now that the Spurs and Pistons have played each other twice this year, of course, if they met again, it wouldn't be until the NBA Finals. And again, we do need to discuss that because these 2 teams are some of the top teams of the league, so they have good chances of possibly going to the finals. So the Spurs finished the season 2-0 against the Pistons. They basically, like I said, whether it was in Detroit or San Antonio took control in these games. They led by 15 points in Detroit, won by 11, and then they led by 22 points in San Antonio, won by 15. I know it's a small sample size, but again, right now in these 2 matchups we see in this regular season with pretty much whole teams for the Spurs and Pistons, San Antonio does look like the clear favorite in the event these 2 teams were to meet in the NBA Finals in early June. All right, then on the second night of a back-to-back, the Spurs are back home hosting the Los Angeles Clippers for the first time this season. This was the final team the Spurs have not yet played this season, was the Clippers. So the Spurs, I will say, were favored by 7.5. It was the second night of a back-to-back, like I mentioned. There was no Harrison Barnes again due to injury, but the Clippers were also missing two key players in John Collins and Darius Garland, who they recently acquired at the NBA trade deadline. And this was a remarkable game for the Spurs, and let me explain why. So basically, the Clippers took control in the second quarter. They ended up leading by 20 points going into halftime. They were just rolling over the Spurs. Then, early in the third quarter, Kawhi Leonard gives the Clippers their largest lead of the game, 25 points. And normally, when the Spurs this year have gone down by 25, they might make some dents in the other team's lead, but then eventually they end up losing, or they just basically get blown out and they end up just losing. Not on this night. It was really Julian Champagnie and the Spurs' defense early in the third quarter that got them going to start making those steps toward a comeback. The Spurs went on a 22-9 run in that third quarter. Julian Champagnie scored 17 points in the quarter, which is his highest scoring quarter of the season. And so basically now going into the fourth, the Spurs were only down by 11. Then it was pretty much all Spurs in the fourth. They went on an 18-3 run to actually take a 2-point lead in the game, and the game goes down to crunch time. The Spurs make enough stops there in crunch time, and then Julian Champagnie and Stephon Castle end up going to the free throw line in the final minutes of the game. They actually missed some key free throws, both players, but they didn't give up. They actually went and chased their offensive board. So first Champagnie misses. He ends up getting an offensive board, kills a little bit of clock, then passes it to Castle, who gets fouled. Castle makes a free throw, then misses a second one, but runs in, gets his own offensive rebound, and gets a 2-point layup for the final bucket of the game. And so basically, the Spurs ended up winning there in crunch time by 4 points. Again, they made their largest comeback of the season, coming back from a 25-point deficit early in the third quarter. The top three Spurs players in this game, like I mentioned, were Victor Wembanyama, 27 points, 10 rebounds, 4 blocks in only 22 minutes. Now, he was very emotional afterward. And, yes, it's part of the Spurs making their biggest comeback of the season, but also just he even said himself, whether it was post game there on the court, in his interview, or in the media room afterward, he basically said he was just like out of energy. He had nothing left after, again, playing 39 minutes the night before against Detroit, his most minutes since October, and then having to play 22 minutes here against the Clippers. That's all he could play. Basically, his body wasn't letting him play anymore. He basically said he was out. He just had nothing left. He left it all out there on the floor. So obviously he was very emotional to get the win, to help the Spurs get the win there. And so again, that was a big night for Wemby with those 27 points, 10 rebounds, and 4 blocks, considering what his body was undergoing at that time. Also, Julian Champagnie, like I mentioned, had a very strong game with 20 points, 9 rebounds, shot 5 of 8 from 3 in the game in 29 minutes. But again, that third quarter was really significant for the Spurs comeback, where he scores 17 points. I actually put together some video on that third quarter scoring run by Julian, where he scores 17 points. And after doing some research in that piece as well, I noted how Julian has now had 8 games this season with individual quarters of 10 or more points and scoring 20 points or more in those games. So again, if you want to read that, definitely subscribe to thespotupshot.com and check that out. And then De'Aaron Fox had another strong night for the Spurs with 19 points and 9 assists in 30 minutes. I also want to give a shout out to rookie Carter Bryant. On the box score, you're just going to see 5 points and 3 rebounds. But if you watch that game, you'll know how vital the rookie was to the Spurs' comeback, especially in the second half. I mean, just defensively, the Spurs went to more of a zone look against the Clippers in that second half, and Carter's very impactful in that zone just because of how he's able to just be everywhere, guard different players and different schemes, help out, stay on his own man. He has that versatility to switch onto different defenders. He'll go from guarding Kawhi Leonard for possession and then switching on to Brook Lopez. He even got to play some small ball 5 there. And so I think that Carter definitely needs to be mentioned here with his defense. And then not only that, in crunch time in the fourth, he got his first ever crunch time minutes. He played about 2.5 minutes there in the fourth. And sure enough, he made a big play where the Clippers left him open on the center arc 3. The ball gets to him. He did not hesitate. He shot the 3, made it. And that was his first, crunch time basket of his career. So he's basically 1 of 1 in crunch time this year. So again, that's a really good sign that the rookie is not getting scared, losing his confidence in the most vital parts of games, especially in those critical minutes that the Spurs were trying to make this comeback. And it's very interesting because, again, he's been getting more minutes now that Harrison Barnes has been out due to an ankle injury, but it'll be interesting whenever Barnes comes back to see, if Barnes right away gets his spot back, or if he has to try to earn it back with how well Carter Bryant has been playing as of late. And then, like I mentioned, for the Spurs, that was their biggest comeback of the season, coming back from down 25. This is just a crazy stat because it's only happened 3 times that they've been down by 25. They are now 1-2 when down by 25 points. So again, that is not a bad record right there to be about 33% winning percentage when you're down by 25 points. Shows that this team has it in them to make a comeback against a really good team. Because as I mentioned before here in the Spotted Pod, the Clippers have been one of the teams that have been rolling post All-Star break. And then also one thing to know about the Spurs is that this is now their 7th comeback win when down by 15 or more points. So now think about this. They're only 7-9, again, slightly under 500 when trailing by 15 or more points this season. All right, let's close out this recap of the week with a Spurs win on Sunday, hosting the Houston Rockets, playing the Rockets for the final time this season. The Spurs were favored by 5.5 points. Again, no Harrison Barnes due to injury. And of course, the Rockets are without Steven Adams and Fred VanVleet due to injuries for the remainder of the season. The Spurs led for most of the first half, then they really took over and put the game away in the third quarter. They started off the third quarter with a 27-12 run. They blew the game open. They ended up leading by 19 points going into the fourth, and then basically they just dominated in that second half. They led by as many as 30 points and won comfortably by 25 points with like 4 minutes left. Ime Udoka pulled all his starters and set the reserves in there, and then same thing, Coach Mitch Johnson did that for the Spurs. And so the Spurs in their finale against Houston this season, they ended up winning easily by 25 points. The Spurs had 5 players play very well here, and especially because they had their best night on offense of the season. Wemby ends up with 29 points, 8 rebounds, 4 blocks, and 2 steals in only 30 minutes. Stephon Castle, while yes, guarding Kevin Durant on one end, also ends up with 23 points, 5 assists, shot 3 of 4 from the three-point line in 26 minutes. De'Aaron Fox goes off for 20 points and 10 assists, and he scored a season-high 14 points from dunk layup range. I mean, he was just living in the paint, could get as deep as he needed to in there, and he does all this in just 32 minutes. Rookie Dylan Harper had a game for himself with 19 points and 6 assists in only 26 minutes. Also had his 3-ball going 3 of 4 from outside, but then, of course, just attacking inside. Julian Champagnie had a good game with 11 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists in 29 minutes, also shot 3 of 6 from 3. And then one of the 6 Man of the Year candidates, Keldon Johnson, ends up with 20 points in 26 minutes. Also, I want to note Keldon's very notable defense on Kevin Durant. Whenever Castle went to take a break and the Spurs needed someone to guard Durant, it was now Keldon. And Keldon did a very good job of being physical with Durant, just playing really good physical, denied defense on him. And then as soon as KD caught the ball, if it was closer to the baseline area, the Spurs would send help toward Keldon's way, like with Wemby coming to help or other players. And so, again, I need to credit Keldon's defense there against KD and also Stephon Castle's defense against the Rockets' go-to player. And so the Spurs end up defeating the Rockets 3-1 in the season series this year. And I do want to note how the Spurs have just gotten better as they face Houston each time. So let's go back to their first meeting in November. The Spurs' largest lead in that game was 12. The Rockets' largest lead was 11. The Spurs won by 11 in San Antonio. That was an NBA play-in game, not NBA play-in game, NBA Cup game, should I say, NBA Cup. Then they meet again in late January, on January 20th. This game's in Houston. The Spurs, this was one of their letdown games where they actually led Houston by 16 points, but then the Rockets made a comeback, and the Rockets' biggest lead was 7, and the Rockets ended up winning closely by 5 points. That was the only game Houston took in the series. Then in another late January game on I think it was January 28th, the Spurs, had more control here. They, the Rockets did lead by 16 in this game, but the Spurs made a comeback and they ended up leading comfortably by 15. And then the Spurs ended up winning comfortably by 12 points. And then, of course, the early March game on Sunday that just took place where the Spurs led by as many as 30. The Rockets' largest lead was 1. And so the Spurs won easily by 25 points. So again, just because of what I've seen this year in these 4 games between these two teams, if the Spurs meet the Rockets in either round 2 or 3 in the playoffs, if those teams get that far, both of them, then I really, again, based on what I've seen this season, I really have a lot of confidence that the Spurs can take down the Rockets, probably like in 5 games, maybe 6 the most that the series would go to. And again, I know that in this Sunday game, the Spurs shot out of this world from 3. They had their best shooting night from 3, shooting 53%, but it's really their defense. I mean, they just have the perfect defense against Houston where they have those physical players like Castle, like Keldon, who can guard KD before he catches catches the ball. But then once KD does catch the ball, the Spurs have those different schemes to trap him, send a double his way, and as soon as he gives it to like Amin Thompson or Şengün or Jabari Smith Jr. The only player who I am a little scared of for the Spurs against is Reed Shepherd, but even him, I think he shot like 4 of 10 on the night against the Spurs. So again, they just don't have enough shooting, Houston, from what I've seen, where it allows the Spurs to play those different kind of zones and also those kind of matchups where they can send help toward Durant and get the ball out of his hands. And if you're doing that, taking the ball out of their best shooter, their best creator, Kevin Durant, then yeah, you have a really good shot at beating the Rockets. And so again, that's one of the reasons why I'm very confident the Spurs would win a playoff series as of what I've seen right now through 4 games. Also, the fact that the Rockets defense just is not the same without Steven Adams there. We know that Adams is gone for the rest of the season due to injury. And I really feel like the more I've watched the Spurs and Rockets, the Spurs, with the Rockets having Şengün there at 5 or, other players, maybe Clint Capella, they're not able to shut down the paint as they were able to do early against the Spurs. And that's one thing you saw was that, De'Aaron Fox was living the paint, Stephon Castle, Dylan Harper, Wemby is just attacking the paint over and over. And so again, I think that's if you can't keep the Spurs out of the paint, that's their biggest strength on offense, then you're in trouble as a defense. And again, I think that's why the Spurs had their best offensive night of the season there against Houston. All right, so how did the Spurs do compared to my my prediction and also Vegas's? So in these 4 games last week, I did say that the Spurs, I felt that they would win those 4 games, and so did Vegas. The Spurs were favored in all 4 games, and so they did just that. They swept the week. Now, if you listen to my pod last week, you know that I did throw a Spurs loss in there. I was going to actually preview 5 games, but I ended up being able to record here on Monday evening, and so that's why this Boston game that I predicted the Spurs would lose, I'm going to change my prediction a little bit later, and you'll understand why as I explain it here a little bit later in the episode. All right, for our second topic, let's just talk about how the Spurs have been a juggernaut since late January. So let me explain this, why I say they've been a juggernaut. Since January 15th, the Spurs have not lost consecutive games. They are 20-4 in their last 24 games. And you want to make that look even better, you can say 15-1 in their last 16 games, which is basically from February onward. But again, I want to count in some of those January games because that's where I feel that the Spurs really started to get rolling, was in that late January window. After they did slump a little bit going 4-6 there in mid-January, they've kind of bounced back. And ever since then, they've been on a tear through the league. Again, being a juggernaut. And the reason why I'm calling them a juggernaut is because of what they're doing to teams. They're just, they're dominating some of these teams, whether they're bad teams, injured teams, or even some of the good teams like Houston and Detroit. They're just putting 20, 30-point leads on some of these really good quality teams. So let's look at some of their leads. They've led by 15 points in 19 of their last 24 games, and they've only lost 1 of those games. The rest of them, they've won all of them. The only team to make a comeback on them when they were leading by 15 in these last 24 was Houston in that January 20th game. They've also, again, been dominating by leading by 20 points in half of their last 24 games. So again, 12 of their last 24 games, they've led by 20 points. Again, just dominating juggernaut territory here, just building these huge leads on teams. Let's talk about 30-point leads, where they're just, going to another level in terms of beating a team. They've led by 30 in 5 of their last 24 games. So again, just these, sometimes just getting these huge leads on teams. And even like a good team like Houston, they just did that, going up by 30 against the Rockets here on Sunday. Now, what does that mean by leading, by building all these big leads? Well, they've been taking care of business in a lot of these games, where they've now won 17 of these 24 games by double digits. So again, they're getting these more comfortable wins with these huge leads that they're putting up. Let's talk about how on the other end, they're not really falling into holes against these teams in the last 24. They've only trailed by double digits in 7 of their last 24 games, and they've actually made 4 comebacks when down by 15 points. So let's talk about those 4 comebacks. They made a 16-point comeback against the Rockets on January 28th. They made a 16-point comeback against the Golden State Warriors right before the All-Star break. They made a 15-point comeback right after the All-Star break against the Toronto Raptors. And then, of course, they just made their biggest comeback of the season, coming back from down 25 points to the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, they have had 4 losses. I will note that. But again, they have not had consecutive losses. They've only lost once and then figured it out and won again. So those 4 losses were to barely. These are some narrow losses, should I say, except for one of them, and you'll understand why. So their first loss during the stretch, the last 24, was a 5-point loss to the Rockets. Again, one of the better teams out in the league, 600 or better record. Their one, I would say, biggest letdown loss was a late January loss to the New Orleans Pelicans, where the Spurs lost by 9. Of course, we know the Pelicans are a lottery team. They're not doing very well. But, hey, they beat the Spurs, so that's probably like the only really, really, really bad loss for the Spurs is that one against the Pelicans, because that's the one team they should have defeated. They lost by in Charlotte by 5 points during these last 24 games. But again, the Charlotte Hornets have been a very good team lately since All-Star break, or not All-Star break, since basically like January onward or Christmas onward. They've been rolling. So again, it's not too much to, it's not too much of a letdown to say you lost to Charlotte. They've been a very good team, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And then I would say the only game where the Spurs got rolled over in a game was that Sunday game in New York against the Knicks recently, where they did lose by 25 points. That was their biggest loss of the season. So again, they've only lost 4 times in their last 24 games, and most of those have been close losses except for the Knicks game and then the Pelicans game. Again, those are like the 2 outliers, I would say. So again, that again leads to that resume of lately being a juggernaut since mid-January. Now, I do want to note that it has been a more of a favorable schedule for the Spurs. When I look back at, whether they were favorites or underdogs in all these last 24 games, they were basically favored in 21 of those games, and only 3 times they were the underdog. So again, it has been a very favorable schedule, but again, give the Spurs credit, the fact that they're not slipping up and really, losing some of those games where they should win on paper. And again, they've had some big some upsets. The 2 upsets they had was defeating the Rockets in January, and then also defeating the Pistons in Detroit there by 11 points. So what has really changed for the Spurs? So here's the 2 timelines I'm looking at to see what's really changed for them and why they're rolling right now. So let's look at from start of the season to January 14th. The Spurs were 27-13. Again, not a bad record, a pretty good team right there. They had the 10th ranked offense scoring 116.3 points per 100. They had the 3rd best defense, 111.6 points per 100, and they had the 7th best net rating at plus 4.7. So now let's look at what's happened from January 15th to today, that I'm recording this on March 9th before the games take place. Again, like I said, they're rolling. They're 20-4 during the stretch. Their offense has completely taken off. Again, they went to that little struggle where they were really struggling to shoot from outside in early January and late December. But since then, they've really got their offense to get going again, especially the outside shooting has been there on most nights. And then, of course, like I said, they're able to live in the paint or get to the free throw line. And so they have the 2nd best offense during this stretch, scoring 119.3 points per 100. Their defense has gotten better. I know ranking-wise, they're 5th during the stretch, but they're holding teams to less points per 100 during the stretch, holding teams to 108 points per 100. And again, they're just rolling teams right now. They have a net rating of plus 11.4, which is 1st in the league since January 15th. So again, that's some of the things that we're seeing here, is that their defense has gotten better and their offense has really gone to another level here in these last 24 games. Now, after defeating the Rockets and then also defeating the Pistons, I just want to kind of take a look at where the Spurs stand with 18 games left against some of the teams they're likely to see in the postseason from each conference. So let's begin with the West, because obviously we know the Spurs will be in the Western Conference playoffs. So against OKC, the number 1 team out West, they're 4-1. Against the Minnesota Timberwolves, they are 1-2, who are 3rd. The Rockets are 4th. They're 3-1. Spurs. The Lakers are 5th here, and the Spurs are 3-1. Then it's the Nuggets, 1-0. The Spurs are. So I'm really eager because the Spurs are going to play the Nuggets here coming up in the last 18 games 3 more times. So that'll give me a better idea of how the Spurs are going to fare possibly in the postseason against Denver. Against the Phoenix Suns, the Spurs are 1-2, but again, they haven't really seen the full Suns team after blowing them out in Austin recently. The Spurs haven't seen what the Suns team fully looks like because Dylan Brooks has been injured. Jalen Green wasn't available in the early November games that the Spurs lost to the Suns. So what's interesting about the Suns again is that though that is one of the teams the Spurs are very likely to face in round 1 of the playoffs. Because if the Spurs finish with the 2nd seed, it would be the Suns or Golden State Warriors right now battling for that play-in, and whoever wins that game in the play-in ends up moving up to play the number 2 seed. So it'd be a 2 versus 7 or 2 versus 8 matchup. Behind the Suns is the Golden State Warriors. Again, the Spurs are 1-2 against the Warriors. So obviously we know the Warriors beat them in November twice in those NBA Cup games, but the Spurs, took care of Golden State in Golden State. There was no Stephen Curry in that game, and we also haven't seen the Spurs against this version of the Warriors with Curry healthy, with Kristaps Porzingis. We know that Jimmy Butler will be out for the entire playoffs. So again, that's also a team to watch. That's a team that the Spurs could play in round one. And then there's the Clippers, who the Spurs have only played once, and obviously they made the 25-point comeback. They're going to play the Clippers a few more times here in these last 18 games. And then finally, also the Portland Trailblazers. The Spurs are very unlikely to play them. Right now, they're holding the 10th seed. So Portland's either likely to get eliminated in the play-in or play probably OKC if they make it to the NBA playoffs. And the Spurs are 1-1 against Portland. Now, let's just say that the Spurs were to make it all the way to the Eastern Conference, not to the Eastern Conference, to the NBA Finals. So now let's look at the top four contenders out East, how the Spurs have done against these teams so far this year. Against the Detroit Pistons, the Spurs are 2-0. Again, they took care of business pretty comfortably in those two games against Detroit. Against the Boston Celtics, the Spurs are 1-0, defeating Boston earlier this season. But now, this coming week on Tuesday, we're going to see how the Spurs fare against the Celtics, who do have Jason Tatum back. So again, that's going to be a very interesting matchup. We know that the Spurs have struggled against the Knicks. They're 1-1 this year against the Knicks. And if we count the NBA Cup game, the Spurs are 1-2. So as I mentioned in the last week's pod, the Knicks have just been a really bad matchup so far for San Antonio. And then against the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Spurs have not had success against the Cavs. They're 0-2 this season, but we haven't seen the Spurs against this version of the Cavs with James Harden now on the team. So again, if these two teams they went that far, both of them, and they ended up making it to the finals, we know that would be an interesting matchup because there would be no prior data to kind of look at for that kind of matchup because the Cavs didn't have Harden when they beat the Spurs twice. I think it was both wins were in December. So again, that's just kind of a look at how the Spurs have been dominating lately since January, but then also as the playoffs are approaching here in 18 games, some of the matchups the Spurs might have, just kind of how they fared in the regular season against some of these playoff bound teams so far in the NBA.
Let's keep going.
All right, for our third topic, let's look at the season honors for the Spurs players. So obviously with a bunch of wins this year and doing really well, the Spurs have been gaining a lot of attention from the league and winning a bunch of the in-season awards so far. Just today on Monday that I'm recording this episode, Victor Wembanyama was named the Western Conference Player of the Week for Week 20, his second time winning this. So I'm just going to kind of go through where each player's at in the awards races, or should I say where they've been mentioned in the season awards so far, and then where they might stand for possible end of the year awards. So let's talk about Wemby, of course, who's likely to be in most of the award races. So he has now won the Western Conference Player of the Week twice. He's been a nominee so far this year 4 times. After winning this past week. He was also a Player of the Month in February for the first time this season. And of course, he's dominating on defense. He was the Defensive Player of the Month in both January and February. So right now, again, Victor has a very narrow window of games to miss. I believe it's like 4 to 4.5 games left to miss. He hasn't missed a game since coming back from that injury in I think it was late December or early January. So he's been able to come into play in all these games. So if he's able to meet the requirement of the 65 game rule, then he is on track right now to make all NBA first team. And I was actually putting together a model recently last week, just looking at where Wemby would shake out in the MVP race statistically at least. And honestly, after running all the different numbers that I have in different sites that I trust with their data, I honestly found that Wemby would probably become third when we're just looking at a statistical perspective because of what he's doing both on offense and especially on defense. Right now, I do still see Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as the leader to most likely take the MVP. Then right behind him, Nikola Jokic. Again, maybe that changes with how well Wemby's been playing as of late, and especially if the Spurs close out the season really well. All three players are close. I do want to note that how Wemby, Jokic, and SGA are very close to missing the requirement for games, so that's why it's really tough on all three of those players to make sure that they remain healthy going forward. Jokic especially has no room for error. I think he can only miss one game the rest of this year. So again, Wemby and SGA have a little bit more room to miss games. And also, we do note that Wemby was an All-Star this past year, an All-Star starter, and he continues to remain the front runner for Defensive Player of the Year this year, and he's also on his way to making an all-defensive first team. Again, all it really comes down to is his health. As long as he meets the requirement for meeting the games mark, 65 game mark, he has a really good chance of pulling down a lot of winning a lot of those awards, and especially moving further into the MVP race, especially if the Spurs continue to win games and if he continues dominating like he has done in February and so far in early March. All right, let's talk about Wemby's fellow All-Star teammate, De'Aaron Fox. So Fox has had 2 Player of the Week nominees this year. He hasn't won one. He was also a Player of the Month nominee once this season, but didn't win it. But we do want to note that he was named an All-Star earlier this year. Again, using that same model that I put together with a bunch of stats for players that might be All-NBA players, I don't see that Fox is on pace right now to be an All-NBA first or second team or even third team member right now with the season that he's put together, despite him, despite the Spurs having a lot of success. Let's look at Stephon Castle. Castle has won the Player of the Week once this season. That 1 week when he had like a 40-point game. I think it was like a 40-point triple-double. He won the Player of the Week that week. He's also been a nominee for Defensive Player of the Month. He had his first nominee in February, even though Wemby won that award. And so I am interested to watch Castle in terms of whether or not he makes one of the all defensive teams, first or second team. Again, statistically, I don't think his numbers are there with some of the other top players on defense, but I think because of the matchups he's had, the way he's shut down a lot of the top scorers, not shut them down, but made it very difficult, efficient nights for a lot of those top scorers in the league that he guards, and his versatility, guarding different, whether it's Kevin Durant or Cade Cunningham, he has just such versatility in who the Spurs have him guard each night. I am interested to see if the media takes notice and might give him some nominations for the one of the all defensive teams later on this year. Rookie Dylan Harper, he won his first Rookie of the Month in February. It was also his second nomination for that award this season. And what's interesting there is that Harper is the only other Western Conference rookie to win the Player of the Month, because the Rookie of the Month, because Cooper Flagg of the Dallas Mavericks has been dominating that award all season. So Cooper's been the only one to win that award every month. But because he only played in 4 games of February, and Harper played in 10 games, and Harper had pretty good numbers, Harper ended up winning the February award. Now I do think that Harper has a chance to come in the top 3 overall voting. I don't think he'll beat either Con Knipple or Cooper Flagg, who are the 2 favorites for Rookie of the Year, just because they get more opportunity, there with their teams with Dallas and Charlotte, and also Con's numbers are really eye popping, and same thing for Cooper too. But Con's is actually on a winning team, so I do think though that Harper has a chance to come third in voting for Rookie of the Year. Whether that's going to come down to him beating either VJ Edgecombe, Cedric Coward, or Derek Queen, and then also I think that Harper has a really good chance of getting on one of the all rookie teams as well with the season he's put together. Considering again that he's been out of all these rookies that I'm mentioning, he's been the one player who's had to come off the bench all year, whereas these other players have either they've spent maybe some time coming off the bench, or most of them have all been starters on their various teams with more opportunities. So again, Harper, despite being in a more limited role in San Antonio behind a team with Stephon Castle and De'Aaron Fox in the front court, he's still getting his minutes and making the most of what he can do there, and getting his name there in some of the all rookie honors. Next up, let's look at Keldon Johnson. So, there's no monthly awards for Sixth Man of the Year, but I still think that Keldon has a very strong chance of possibly being one of the players to end up with the Sixth Man of the Year award. Some other players, though, that are still in the running with him are Naz Reid of the Timberwolves, Jaime Jaquez Jr. of the Heat, Reed Shepherd of the Rockets, and then of course Tim Hardaway Jr. of the Nuggets. And also one player to mention, I saw him on one of the gambling sites, and also when I ran my algorithm with the numbers, he actually rated out very high, was Harper, Keldon's own teammate. There are nights that yes, Harper's like the better sixth man in a game, and so yes, they kind of share that duty, even though I think Keldon's been the more consistent player this year. He's had more 20 plus point games, of course. So again, it's just interesting to note that yes, Harper could also be considered a Sixth Man of the Year candidate, but I think Keldon is one of the players there who's going to finish for sure in the top 3, whether he's number 1 or number 2, alongside Naz Reid and maybe Jaime Jaquez Jr. And then finally, Coach Mitch Johnson has a good shot here of maybe getting Coach of the Year. So far, he's won 2 Coach of the Month awards. He won in December, and he also just won now in February. Coach Johnson is the only coach so far this season to win that award twice this year, and also he has 3 nominations. I do think right now he's probably going to end up finishing in the top 3, whether that's alongside JB Bickerstaff of the Pistons, Joe Mazzulla of the Boston Celtics, or maybe even someone like Charles Lee, who has got the Charlotte Hornets to bounce back and be a really good team. So again, I think Coach Johnson as well has a chance there of getting Coach of the Year with the big leap that the Spurs have already made. Again, right now, they're already at 47 wins. They were only projected to win 44 games according to Vegas back in August. So again, he's already taken the Spurs to another level. Right now, they're actually on pace for 60 wins. And if OKC starts to slip up here in these last 18 games, then who knows? Maybe San Antonio could end up getting the best record in the league. We'll just see, because OKC has started to get going again and getting back on the winning path. All All right, so before we close out this episode, let's look ahead to the next 3 games for the Spurs. So finally, there's no more back-to-backs this week. There's just one game, and then you get a day of rest in between. So let's look at the Spurs, how they're doing in their last 10 before I start talking about all these teams. So the Spurs are rolling, like I mentioned, 9-1 in their last 10. They have the 3rd best offense during this time frame, the 5th best defense, and the best net rating. So let's go to Tuesday. The Spurs are hosting the Boston Celtics. The Celtics are also rolling right now. They are 8-2 in their last 10 games. They have the 4th ranked offense and 3rd best defense, and also 3rd best net rating during the stretch. Now, I do want to note that I looked at Vegas's over-under, and the Spurs are early 3.5-point favorites as of Monday evening. Now, last week I did say the Celtics will win, but now after seeing what the Spurs did this past week to both the Pistons and the Houston Rockets, plus making that big 25-point comeback against the Clippers, I'm changing my prediction here. I'm going to go ahead and say that the Spurs win this one, and especially because Boston is barely. I know he's been playing pretty well. They're in that transition mode right now of bringing back Jason Tatum, who is more of a high usage player, kind of incorporating him in back against some good quality teams here. And so again, I just feel like because they're in that transition period, Boston of trying to get Tatum acclimated again and see where he fits in their team. I do think that gives the Spurs an advantage because they've been rolling as of late, plus the game will be in San Antonio. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the Spurs win against Boston here on Tuesday. Then on Thursday, the Spurs are hosting the Denver Nuggets, playing them for the 2nd time this season. The Nuggets, I will mention, are kind of struggling right now. They're 5-5 in their last 10. They have the 11th ranked offense, but 17th ranked defense. They have the 15th net rating, barely winning their games, plus 2.2 net rating during this stretch. So because of how much the Nuggets are struggling right now, again, barely being 500 in their last 10, I am going to say the Spurs win this game. I am, though, watching this game more importantly, though, because this is one where I don't really have a good feel. Like, against, like, the Lakers, the Rockets, the Thunder, I have pretty good feelings of where I think the Spurs, how the Spurs will do against those teams in the playoffs. Whereas Denver, we only saw them play once in November, and it was a big comeback for the Spurs. They made a big comeback that night, and I think Wemby was out for that game. So, again, it's not the same Spurs team, and it's not the same Nuggets team. Plus, we don't know exactly, the Nuggets still don't look like they're whole yet. They haven't had, Aaron Gordon and some of their players consistently in their games. So again, this is one of those where I'm just trying to figure out, the matchup between Jokic and Wemby, if they guard each other, what that looks like. I'm seeing how much if the Spurs guards are able to get into the paint, is Stephon Castle guarding Jamal Murray? How does he do against Jamal Murray? All those kind of questions. So I'm really eager to see this one because this could be a matchup we see in round 2 or 3 of the playoffs. And then also on Saturday, the Spurs close out this week with a game against those surging Charlotte Hornets. Now the Hornets are 6-4 in their last 10, so they are they're still winning basketball, but it's not at the level of like the Celtics or the Spurs. They're 6-4 in their last 10. They have the best offense during the stretch, 123 points per 100 possessions. They have the 10th best defense during the stretch. And then their net rating is 2nd best to only the Spurs. So again, the Hornets are a team that has been rolling, but they did just lose recently on what was it, Sunday night to the Phoenix Suns. So because it's at home, and again, Charlotte barely beat the Spurs last time in Charlotte, even though the Spurs, were down by a lot in that game early on. I'm going to go and say that the Spurs win this game just because they've been rolling lately. So my prediction is 3-0. But because this is one of those weeks where the Spurs are playing a lot of good teams again, I could see 2-1, maybe 1-2 there on the table. But again, my prediction right now is 3-0, and I'll be back with the pod before the following week's games after that.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of Spotted Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spotted Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.